Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the launch of a net zero roadmap for the European mineral wool insulation industry. My name is Sonja van Rensen, and I have the pleasure of moderating the next hour for you. I'm editor-in-chief of Energy Monitor, a website dedicated to the global energy transition, and I'm a freelance energy and climate journalist here in Brussels. So we're going to spend the next hour talking about what comes next for net zero, for the mineral wool insulation industry, for European industry more broadly, and also on the policy front, because we're coming to the end of the current political cycle. Next year we'll have parliamentary elections, we'll have a new commission taking the reins in the autumn. So it seems like a very good moment to take a step back from the day-to-day, and there's lots happening day-to-day, to talk about what actually needs to be done in the longer term, going forward in business, in policy, to actually get us to the net zero ambition we're all aiming for. So to fill the next hour, we've got a number of excellent speakers lined up for you. Dr. Catherine Richardson, joining us from the University of Copenhagen, where she heads up their Sustainability Science Center. Welcome, Catherine. We have Kurt van der Berge joining us from the European Commission, where he recently started as Director General for DG Klima, so heading up climate action policy there. We have Anthony Abetz. Hi, Anthony. A board member of Eurima, our hosting organization today, and Emmanuel Normand, similarly a board member of Eurima. And finally, Director General of Eurima, Jan de Bos. Before we kick off, just one or two practicalities. Today's event is being recorded, so you can go back and watch at your leisure. Secondly, we're going to take the first half an hour, 40 minutes probably, with a debate and some reactions, some content on the new roadmap, reactions to it. After that, we will have time for your questions, so please do send those in. You should see a box on your screen just below us, which lets you send in any questions you may have, so please do so. And thirdly, the Eurima Net Zero Roadmap is available online at eurima.org, so you can download that from this moment onwards. So to kick us off, Jan, it seemed natural to start with you, and natural to start with a question of why another roadmap? Net zero ultimately is going to depend on individual companies getting to net zero. A lot of these companies already have net zero roadmaps, so what's the value add of a sector-level net zero roadmap?
Yes, thank you, Sonja. What is important to note at the beginning of the event is that in order for the European Union to meet its climate and energy goals for 2050, a renovation and insulation will have to play a pivotal role. Of course, this enabling role is an opportunity for our industry, but also comes with increased responsibility. Of course, striving for climate neutrality starts at company, or even, I would say, at plant level. However, it is important to realize that there are different technologies used, different energy sources used, and that our industry facilities are part of specific local infrastructures with specific energy and policy realities, meaning that reaching carbon neutrality is in practice a joint effort between industry and authorities. Eurima is the voice of the mineral wool insulation industry towards the EU authorities, while our national associations have the same role in EU member states. We will see that for some of the levers that we identified in the report, enabling policy is important, and this is why it's necessary to have developing a sector roadmap at European association level.
So basically you need a European-wide enabling policy to then enable the net zero developments at the local level, each of which will be specific ultimately to those local circumstances. Okay. Let's go straight to the roadmap then. That's what we're here for. And I'd like to hand over to Anthony Abetz for that. As I said, a board member of Eurima, and he's also Director for Public Affairs and Sustainability at the Rockwool Group. He's been with the company for 15 years and has been heading up their sustainability work since 2016. So the new roadmap. I understand the industry has already made substantial progress over the last 30 years. Obviously, we're not at net zero yet, and the big question is, okay, what next? Can we get to net zero? And what kind of levers are you looking for? And I guess in more practical terms, what does that mean when you're looking at actual industrial processes?
Thanks, Sonia. It's a big question. Can we get to net zero? And there's, of course, a lot of sectors that are asking the same question. I'd like to, of course, dig into the decarbonisation levers. But before I do that, I think it's important to put into context the role of our industry in achieving a net zero carbon society. So when we talk about the climate impact of buildings, then we need to differentiate between operational emissions and embodied emissions. Operational emissions, they're those emissions that are taking place during the lifetime of a building, during the use of a building. So they're coming from water, space heating, cooling, lighting of a building. When you talk about embodied emissions, then you're talking about emissions coming from the manufacturing of the building materials. You're talking about the construction phase. You're also talking about the end of life phase. And it's important when we talk about decarbonising the building sector that you differentiate between those two. If we take operational emissions, we have a huge challenge there. I mean, there are currently 210 million buildings in the EU that together use more energy and emit more CO2 than any other sector. So it's a huge challenge. Without addressing the EU's biggest CO2 emitters, which are buildings, then we're not going to get to climate neutrality. So therefore, a deep renovation of these buildings, and in particular using, amongst other things, insulation, is essential if we're going to get rid of those operational emissions and at the same time create healthier buildings. When we look at embodied carbon, there are different numbers out there. World Green Building Council, they estimate that around 28% of the total carbon emissions, they're coming from embodied emissions. And of course, as we decarbonize the building stock, then of course the embodied emission proportion or part of the cake that will increase, and that means that we need to put even more emphasis on decarbonizing the construction materials. And that means, of course, that we as an industry acknowledge the role that we had. Jan said at the start about our responsibility as an industry, and focusing on minimizing those embodied emissions. If we turn to the next slide, our commitment to decarbonize, that's not new. You mentioned the fact that we had, as an industry, been working at minimizing emissions over a long period of time. I'll come with one stat, and that is in the last 3 decades, we have managed to reduce the carbon intensity by around 40%. So that's since 1990. Now, when we talk about carbon intensity, we're talking about CO2 per ton product. Now, reducing carbon intensity, that is a prerequisite for us to get to carbon neutrality. But of course, we know that reducing carbon intensity is not sufficient by itself. We also need to reduce significantly absolute emissions, and that's where it gets extremely challenging. And it's not because we're just energy intensive, it's because as an industry, we're going to be experiencing significant growth going forward, because we will be busy at delivering those products that are minimizing operational emissions in the building sector. So not only do we need to significantly reduce absolute emissions, we also need to ensure that the production capacity that we're bringing online, that is carbon neutral. And that is a challenge. When we look at the split of our emissions, then roughly 2/3 of our emissions, they're coming from scope 1 and 2. So they're coming from the manufacturing phase. Scope 1 from the manufacturing, scope 2 from the electricity that we're using in the manufacturing. And this is where I'd like to focus on the main levers, because if we're going to get to carbon neutrality, it's there that we need to put a lot of our effort. When we talk about decarbonisation levers, and we move to the 3rd slide here, there are basically 3. The first one, of course, is energy efficiency. As an industry, we always say energy efficiency first. There's no big win. It's a lot of small incremental improvements. But if you have a systematic energy management approach, then you can for sure continue to reduce emissions. And we know, and this is not just for our sector, but for other sectors, irrespective of how long you've been working with energy efficiency, there will always be improvement potential. The second main lever, that is switching to alternative fuel sources. And that sounds very easy. It sounds like you can do it overnight. It's not easy. One of the options that we're looking at as a sector is electrification. This requires actually considerable technology development, and it also requires a lot of infrastructure readiness. For example, in terms of high voltage grid connections. So a prerequisite for the acceleration of this lever is the availability of relatively cheap, abundant, renewable sourced electricity. Otherwise, we're not going to get that. The third lever is circularity. You often hear the fact that circularity and decarbonisation, they go hand in hand. We as a sector are not an exception there. And there are good opportunities, both within glasswool and within stone wool, to increase the circular business model that we already have. And perhaps I have an opportunity later to go into a bit more detail about what those opportunities are.
Okay, thank you very much. So I suppose three stats that I would take away. One, embodied emissions represent, according to the World Green Building Council, 28% of total CO2, and that share is likely to go up as we reduce operational emissions, which your products, of course, help with. And then progress since 1990, so carbon intensity down by, or an improvement of 40%. And finally, 2/3 of your industry's emissions are scope 1 and 2. And three levers: energy efficiency, alternative fuels, switching to alternative fuels, and circularity. And I read in the roadmap that increasingly it's that switching to alternative fuels that's likely to become the most impactful lever going forward. And as you highlighted, challenges there around availability of renewables if you want to switch to renewable power, for example. Thank you for that. As I said, the roadmap is already online, so if you want to read more, download it, and you'll see there are additional examples and so forth. What I wanted to do then was turn to Catherine for an initial reaction to that roadmap. So Dr. Catherine Richardson, as I said at the start, a professor at the University of Copenhagen and leader of the Sustainability Science Center there. She spent the past 30 years working on Earth system science and is hopefully a familiar name to you in association with the concept of planetary boundaries, which is something she has helped promote since 2009 when it was first introduced. So, Catherine, a question to you is, well, a quick reaction to what you've just heard. And if we think beyond the roadmap per se, what would you say companies need to be doing more of to change what they currently do?
Yes, thank you, Sonia. I heard lots of things that I liked hearing in what Anthony just said, but there were also some things that worried me. And one of them is he started out by saying, can we get to net zero? It's a good question. And then later on, he said, if we're going to receive, I mean, this isn't a can we or an if. This is a need to have, not a nice to have. And I hope we can begin to recognize this as an existential crisis that really does need to be solved if we want our society to continue to develop. The other thing that worries me a little bit is this decarbonization. We all know what we mean when we say decarbonization, but we're all desperately dependent on carbon. We can't get rid of carbon in the ecosystem that we're a part of. What we need to do is to make sure that we are not putting reactive carbon into the atmosphere. And this is what this is all about. I did hear very good things from, obviously I haven't read the decarbonization plan yet. The deep renovation of existing buildings is a no-brainer. What becomes worrying is the new building. the new building that we're going to have. And just reducing carbon intensity isn't going to solve that problem. And the question then becomes whether we should be working with budgets and every company, including the companies involved in Eurima, want to continue to grow, want to have a larger market. We want to build more. We want to use more of this. And the question is how compatible that is with reducing our release of CO2 to the atmosphere.
Okay, so a question over to what extent can we build more, do more, and at the same time reach these net zero goals, which, as you say, is an existential question that we have to do. It's not, can we? That
I don't think we should be raising, I don't think we should be asking it as a question. Can we do it? Or we have to.
Yeah, okay. And what would you say then, I mean, how should companies be going further at this stage? What kind of a long-term vision do they need? What kind of commitments should we be seeing now that would reassure you further?
I think the most important thing, actually, is that we begin to, we stop talking about solutions, that we stop talking as if we think we're placed above nature and we're going to find a fix that will just make this happen. And I think it's much more important that we accept the fact that we are part of a system, a complex, adaptive system, and that the interactions we have with that system need to be managed. In this particular case, companies need to be focusing on when they're taking materials out of the Earth system, which obviously this industry is, that we're using it as efficiently as possible. Anthony said it, circularity, reusing it, and so on, and that there's no waste. I mean, we're just not talking about reducing waste. We need to be focusing on eliminating waste. So those are the two goals, making sure that the value we get out of using the Earth's resources comes with an absolute minimum of environmental and social damage.
Okay, okay. And I suppose your, in terms of concrete commitments that you would like to see from an industry like the mineral wool insulation industry represented by Eurima, because companies do have, I mean, there is now a sectoral net zero roadmap, there are company net zero roadmaps. So, I mean, there are changes underway. You've heard Anthony talk about what's happening on a technical level. I guess concretely, what else do you want to see?
Well, maybe this is where we should start with my slide, because I think we are actually. I wasn't going to start it with that one, but the picture of the Earth. We've had the picture of the Earth. We've had the evidence that we need to do this since the late 60s, beginning of the 70s, and it's only recently that we've actually accepted what this picture's showing us, and you know. Clearly, there's no umbilical cord. So anything we throw into the system isn't going to just leave us. And that includes greenhouse gases, which is waste in the system. And when we've used the Earth's resources, we're not going to get any more. And don't make no mistake, it's not money that makes us rich. We can't eat money, we can't put money on to stay warm, and we can't live in money. So it's the Earth's resources that make us rich. And the Earth's resources are limited, and therefore all companies need to respect the fact that we are all companies, all people, all politicians, respect the fact that we're a part of this system, and we need to manage our interactions with this system. And just picking out climate, as we've done here, where we have our focus, we forget the fact, and now you can show the rest of the slide, that what makes this planet unique is the fact that there is life. And it's the interaction between life and the energy balance, that is to say climate, that creates the conditions on Earth. And that means that biodiversity and the biodiversity crisis is at least as important as the climate crisis. And we need to be very careful as we go forward with this tremendous focus on climate and decarbonization, which is never going to happen because carbon is a part of life, that we don't make bad decisions that come to influence the biodiversity, which is just as important as climate. So I think it's this systemic approach to things that we need to be looking at, and moving away from the idea that we can just find a technological fix, and then it will be business as usual. We've lost our innocence. We will have to manage our relationship with the planet as a whole, the environment of the planet as a whole, from now and forever forward, if we want to have societies that can continue to evolve.
Okay, thank you. Anthony, we've lost our innocence. We need to be thinking about biodiversity as much as climate. We need a systemic, all-encompassing approach. I mean, to what extent do you think, I guess the roadmap's a starting point, but to what do you think the industry, I mean, has digested and accepted that this is the position we're in? And is it able to, willing to, prepared to move beyond business as usual? What comes next?
I mean, I totally agree with Catherine that this is an existential crisis that we're in, and therefore we cannot, as corporates, as industry, continue as business as usual. I'm really glad that Catherine was provocative there. You can always depend on Catherine to be provocative, but the if and the whens, I think Emmanuel will get back to that, but we as companies, irrespective of how ambitious we are about our goals and where we want to be by a certain year, we're within an ecosystem, and we're dependent on, amongst other things, conducive regulatory conditions. And if they're not there, it will be extremely difficult to get there. One example is regarding the grid connections, the power grid connections. If you go to the plant level within our company, then they're basically telling us that it's first come, first serve. So, and there are long queues. So if you don't get into that queue, then you can wait 5, 6, 7 years before you can get that grid connection, before you can actually electrify. So therefore, we're dependent on that infrastructure readiness. We're dependent on an acceleration in that if we as a company or we as an industry are going to be able to get where we want to get. Come with 3 quick examples of what we're doing, which we think is as an industry is moving the dial towards the carbon neutrality. One is the electrification. We put together the largest electrical melter in the industry in Norway back in 2020. A good example of collaboration with the public sector, because it was co-financed by Enova, the Norwegian state fund, and they co-financed it because we were moving into new territory from a technology perspective. We wouldn't have been able to do it if we hadn't got that support, and now we've managed to reduce emissions by plus 70% compared to the conventional technology, and there's still room for improvement. Another example, that was an example from Rockwool. Another example is with Saint-Gobain. They have this technology which is called the submerged burner melter technology, and this shows that circularity and decarbonisation can go hand in hand. The fact that Saint-Gobain is using biomass at their plant in Ploiești in Romania means that they have reduced CO2 emissions by 30%, and then they're able to ensure that there is no waste going to landfill, because it's all the waste is internally recycled. And a final example is from Knauf Insulation, where we're utilizing the roof space of our manufacturing facility in Vizé in Belgium, and that means that it's the largest solar panel installation in the country.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for the concrete examples. A good moment then to bring in Kurt. Kurt van den Berge, as I said, newly appointed Director General for the Climate Department at the European Commission. He's been with the Commission for over 25 years, in many roles advising commissioners. He was, just before this job, the European Green Deal advisor in von der Leyen's cabinet, but has also worked closely in DG Research and headed up the cabinet for Janis Potočnik back when he was Environment Commissioner. So you're an old hand in this field, and a bit the same point or the same question as to Anthony. We've lost our innocence. I guess it's one question for industry, and Anthony's just said, okay, but we operate in a policy framework, grid connections being a case in point. Have policymakers fully grasped the existential nature of net zero, the way that Catherine laid it out. Are policies in line with that? And what's your take on what an industry like the mineral wool insulation industry is doing at the moment? Have we got the policies in place and it's now up to them to act, or would you say no, there's more that we Commission can do as well?
Thank you very much, Sonia. Thank you for introducing me as an old hand. But it's roadmaps like this one from Eurima that keeps me and my colleagues young. We welcome Eurima's roadmap also as a timely contribution. The recent spike in energy prices as a result of the Ukraine event shown how much climate action and energy security go hand in hand, and are also good for innovation, job creation, individuals' health, etc. Reducing the CO2 emissions by 55% by 2030, which is now the binding goal for Europe, at least 55%. That requires all sectors to contribute, including the building sector. And we know that to achieve our 2030 target, we need a reduction of 60% of greenhouse gas emissions from buildings, a 14% reduction in final energy consumption, and an 18% reduction in energy consumption for heating and cooling compared to 2018. So this sector's contribution cannot be overestimated, and that's also why the Commission, as you know, launched a renovation wave, which we're trying still to ignite. We need a doubling of the renovation rate. All happen, the European Union follows a multi-pronged approach. It puts in place the enabling policy, as Jan was saying. We put on pollution because, to pick up on Catherine's point, nature cannot bear it. And with targets, we come up with regulation there where markets fail or do not deliver quickly enough. And we couple that with a funding framework to enable the innovation and investment, both with public funds and with private funds. I think it's fair to say that the pricing and regulatory framework for achieving our 2030 targets are now getting into place, and I was happy to see that the roadmap recognizes the role of emission trading and the Renewable Energy Directive, for example. We now have a revised emission trading system with higher ambition, also to buildings and road transport. So in a few years, the ETS will cover more than 70% of our economy's emissions, and that together with a strengthened energy or effort sharing regulation with the member states. And the good thing about this is that we reinvest the revenues from pollution pricing, from emission trading into energy and climate through the Innovation Fund, Modernization Fund, but also very importantly, the Social Climate Fund, which will, as of 26, help to really continue and reinforce this renovation wave. In the meantime, we've had also last week an agreement, a political agreement on the Energy Efficiency Directive. As Anthony was saying, and we say exactly the same, energy efficiency first, that's our strong principle. That directive now includes a requirement to consider the whole life greenhouse gas emissions of buildings, which we will take forward in the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, where we have proposed to make reporting on whole life greenhouse gas emissions mandatory for new buildings. And we also take that further in the construction products regulation, namely to strengthen the provision of information on life cycle climate performance of products. As you see, this sounds a bit policy techy, but it is a very comprehensive framework that we are putting in place. And we are now working with the European Commission for reduction of whole life carbon of buildings. That will support the transition to a real circular economy, which is an ask in the roadmap of Eurima. I fully concur with the request of Eurima for affordable and decarbonized energy. That's why we have increased the targets, as you all know, for renewable energy to 45% by 2030. We reports could easily even get to 50% by 2030. And later this week, the European Commission will put out a proposal for reforming the electricity market design, as well as a Net Zero Industry Act to make sure that we have the industry in place, the industrial capacity to make this happen. We also put in place a lot of funding through Next Generation EU, Repower EU, as I said, the Innovation Fund from ETS and Horizon Europe to stimulate research and innovation. And I really would like to stress the point on systemic innovation. Renovations have to become faster, easier, and deeper. And I really would call on Eurima and its companies to seek partnerships with other sectors like finance, the public sector, but also the heating sector, to develop quality assured renovation strategies. What we welcome in the roadmap is that it does not foresee any offsetting outside the sector's value. Carbon capture, storage and utilization will need to come in play, but for residual emissions on top of carbon reductions. And as you know, we have just proposed a carbon removal certification framework, which I assume will also be of great interest to Eurima and its companies. We know that climate neutrality pledges and claims by companies and sector organizations can be tricky. There's always the risk of greenwashing. And that is something the European Commission is addressing as well. We do that in different ways through the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, but also through a forthcoming proposal for regulatory green claims, for regulating green claims. Next to the risk of greenwashing, we also have the risk of green wishing. It is not sufficient. It is necessary, but not sufficient to have a 2050 net zero commitment. We also need to know how to get there. So that's why I would call on Eurima to further improve the sectoral roadmap, including by, for example, setting interim targets every 10 or even better 5 years, broken down by scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and to also have yearly progress reports based on third-party verified data. That would make the sector roadmap even better and stronger than it already is. But as I said, the present roadmap is an excellent start of the journey. We have great appreciation for the efforts to reduce the embedded emissions of your products, as Anthony was explaining. And what we find very good to read is that your products already contain a high share of recycled material. We believe there is scope to design products for reuse, and that is definitely a big priority for the Commission in the future on the road to a truly circular economy. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I know there's a lot going on, but a good overview of all the initiatives underway in the pipeline and some very concrete feedback on Eurima's roadmap as well. I wanted to go back to Catherine for a quick reaction of what you've heard from Kurt. So are the Commission's plans going to get us to net zero?
Well, let me be the first to go on record as saying that I do think that the increased ambition level from the EU in the recent time is very obvious and very welcome. I spoke to Cristina Figueres, who was the chief negotiator in Paris for the UN on the Paris Agreement, that said solving the climate crisis is like getting your lorry out of the mud. You can either pull it, but then you can risk losing track of what happens to the backside, or you can push it, but then you risk losing control over where it's actually going. And we have to say that climate in the beginning, in the 90s, for example, was very much a pull from the political side. More recently, it's been a push from companies and citizens. And it's nice to see politicians getting back in and being more ambitious. But no, the answer is no. We're not going to make it to net zero when we're talking about, CCS is going to be, the carbon capture and storage is going to be necessary. We don't have CCS. So we need a plan B, or I mean, at least in terms of CCS from diffuse sources. So we have to remember that although we've been talking about this for years, decades, that the year with the greatest global emission from human activities was 2022, and the year before that was 2021. So emissions are still increasing despite of all of these good intentions. So we need to see something that's going to bend the curve.
Okay, thank you for that. Back to the industry then, with Emmanuel Normand, another board member of Eurima and also Vice President for Sustainable Development at Saint-Gobain. He's been with the company for over 20 years and also heading up its sustainability work since 2016. Previously headed up its insulation activity and also its Asia-Pacific operations. Emmanuel, so we've heard, I guess Kurt has given us a decent overview of what's happening on the EU policy front, including a number of areas of alignment with what Anthony had suggested, is in the roadmap, with what you'd like to see. We've had Catherine's reaction, a reaction from you then on, I guess, based on what you've heard from Kurt. I mean, does this tick the boxes? Are there other asks that you would like to highlight? What do you need to deliver?
No, thanks, Sonia. First, I mean, a lot of what Kurt said is music to my ears. It's very much aligned to what we are requesting as an industry. We're talking about a system transformation. It has been said by Catherine. Clearly the industry as a whole cannot act and to achieve this decarbonization, especially that the decarbonization industry is only to be understandable in the frame of the decarbonization of building and construction. And what we need to achieve is the decarbonization of building and construction as a whole. And clearly, energy efficiency first is a very strong principle. I welcome the agreement that has been achieved last week. I'm looking forward for ambitious agreement on the energy performance building directive this week, typically on ideas as minimum energy performance standards. And we know that there's still a lot of pushbacks and that the devil is in the detail, even if everybody agrees that energy efficiency first is important. When you are looking at the details, you may put that ambition into question. When we are looking at our footprint as such, it has been well said by Anthony. There, I would focus on two main levels. Availability of competitive, abundant green energy, being green electricity, being renewable gas, being biomass or others. There are discussions ongoing in the Renewable Energy Directive. It has been said by Kurt, we will have this week publication of a proposal for a reform of the market design. We are looking for strong ambition. I mean, availability of green energy is absolutely essential, and a number of technologies that the industry is ready to put in place will only be put in place at scale if we have the energy. I mean, it makes no sense to put in place a technology which is not able to be supplied by the right decarbonized energy. Then the second one is on circularity. On circularity, we have the chance in our industry to have products that are infinitively recyclable. Said that, there's still a lot of our materials that at the end of the life goes into landfill. We should prohibit that recyclable material goes into landfill. We should make sure that the cost of landfilling is prohibitive. And in the frame of the discussion on the new framework directive on waste, of a new circular economy plan, I really ask for an ambitious circular economy action plan for building and construction, making sure that all buildings across Europe are a material bank, and particularly a material bank for our industry. And finally, even to accelerate more, I'm welcoming the soon-to-be-published Net Zero Industrial Act. Let's make sure that in this act, energy efficiency enabling industry are well recognized. It's not what I've seen up to now in some documents that has circulated in this Net Zero Industrial Act. And let's make sure, and I think there frames are put in place, that there's the right innovation fund, Repower EU, and others, making sure that the money is flowing into innovation, not only at pilot phase, but even further in demonstration at industrial scale to make sure that we can accelerate on the decarbonization of the industry.
Okay, thank you. 3 clear asks, and I'd like to go back to you, Kurt, to pick up on those. So 1, the availability of competitive, abundant green energy, including through revised electricity market design. Can you make that happen? And I guess I'm thinking too, there's going to be a lot of competition for that energy. I mean, every industrial sector, every household, everyone wants it. So how can you give any reassurances that to an industry like in this case mineral wool insulation, that energy will be available to them? And second, on circularity, will the EU prohibit the landfilling of recyclable materials? And a question came in from the audience as well on the same topic, pointing out that there are many obstacles still to collecting and sorting waste. And the question is, very similarly to what Emmanuel said, how can we stop valuable materials from going to landfill? How can we further incentivize circularity in the construction sector? And then finally, the third point on the Net Zero Industrial Act, and again, there's a question from the audience which picks up on what you just said, Emmanuel. It's going to be out in the next few days. How can it go beyond specific sectors, specific technologies that it is very likely to support, like solar PV, wind, renewable hydrogen? How can it go beyond that and support other sectors which can provide support to decarbonize the EU? And I think energy efficiency and enabling industries, like the one we're talking about today, is probably a good example of that. So could you come back on those 3 points?
Happy to come back on these, Sonia. I first would like to have a quick reaction to what Catherine is saying. I think what we're proving in the EU is that emissions are decreasing. Since 1990, we have seen a decrease of emissions of more than 30%, while our economy has been growing by more than 60% in GDP terms. So I think that's important. It's true that at the global level, emissions are still increasing, 1% growth last year. But it's important to say and show that with sufficient leadership, we can make this coupling between growth and emissions work. We are showing this. In terms of the 3 points from Emmanuel, first on the energy, I was happy to read in The Economist 2 or 3 weeks ago that the events in Ukraine and the consequence in terms of high energy prices, but also thanks to the policies put in place by the European institutions, we have actually fast-tracked the clean energy transition by 5 to 10 years. So the clean energy transition is happening. Much more needs to be done, much more investment, and also the electricity market design will help in this, because what we will be proposing is a paradigm shift in terms of much more long-term planning and structuring of the electricity market, which will help to improve predictability of investment, but also make sure that the lower cost of renewable energy is going to consumers, both households and the industrial sector. Demand management that we will put to the fore as well. Secondly, on circularity, absolutely, there you talk to a convinced audience in the European Commission. We have already put quite a few building blocks in place for this transition. We have the Waste Framework Directive. We have proposed an ambitious package for sustainable product policy, building on the eco-design. As I said, we are working on a roadmap for circularity in the construction sector and the products of the construction sector. But I do believe personally that this will be and will have to be a big priority for the next European Commission. We have just agreed or are about to agree all the legislation for the 2030 target, and we are quite confident that we can achieve the 2030 targets. It won't be a walk in the park, but it is possible to get there. But we're already looking forward to the 2040 target. That is what the European climate law is asking us to do. We will be launching this work in a couple of weeks with a public consultation. And we know already that if we want to achieve the higher targets for 2040, then we have to look beyond decarbonization, as Catherine was rightly saying, into dematerialization. That will be really the challenge, but also opportunities of industrial strategies for the next decade to increase drastically the value we get from each unit of resource. And then on the NZR, the Net Zero Industry Act, I have a lot of sympathy, of course, for requests to also include energy efficiency technologies. What I would like to say is that we need to start with focusing on those technologies and capacity can help us achieve the clean energy transition as directly as possible, so out of unabated fossil fuels. That is our real priority at this moment in time. Nothing prevents from going further in the future. But I also would like to highlight how we in the European Commission are changing our thinking and our measures in terms of supporting industry. To give you one illustration of this, as you may know, later this year we will organize a first European auction for the direct subsidization of renewable hydrogen, which is a feedstock and a fuel that is also of interest to the companies in Eurima, and where for the first time ever we will be subsidizing the production of renewable hydrogen with a fixed premium over the next 10 years. This is a response to the IRA in the United States. And if this works well, then we will also enlarge this to other areas than renewable hydrogen for the zero industry technologies that we need. So yes, all your requests and expectations are well noted. We will follow up on most of them, and if not immediately, then at some point in the future.
Okay, thank you. A reaction from anyone else on the panel to that elaboration from Kurt? Yeah.
Yeah. So coming back on the circularity. And I was part of a delegation court that visited you, part of corporate leaders group here in the last month. And I remember you specifically saying that circularity was critical in order to achieve a cost-efficient green transition. And that's something that we're extremely supportive of in the industry. But as Emmanuel commented, we're challenged because currently there are not, for example, the right price signals when it comes to utilizing our take-back systems instead of sending waste to landfill. If the landfill prices are relatively low, the margins in the construction industry, of course, are also relatively low, then the cheapest solution will always be chosen. So therefore, that is clearly one quick fix, you could say, that could suddenly make recycling of recyclable products much easier. There's also this issue around transporting material across borders. When you view a particular material as a waste, then it becomes extremely difficult. But if you view it as a valuable material that has value added, then it makes it much easier, and that means that you can utilize that material elsewhere. So there's two key areas where where regulation can immediately create a positive impact on a more circular industry and thereby make it more cost efficient.
Okay. So the pricing of making it expensive for things to go to landfill, prohibitively so, as Manuel suggested, and transport of waste across borders shouldn't. If it's waste, it complicates things. Catherine, you also wanted to.
Yes, I'd like to go back to the importance of thinking systemically and not just geographically or sectorally. And of course, I completely agree with Kurt that the EU has been particularly good at decoupling energy and GDP. But if you look at the consumption that we have in the EU, where many of the products we're consuming are coming onto other countries' growing emissions, I'm not sure that we would come out as cleanly. But the energy question we've done very well. Thank you very much. But we need to be looking at this in a system context. And that brings me to my final point, which is I've several times from several speakers heard of all the wonderful things that are happening now that we're using biomass to get green energy. But even in the EU, if you look at the biodiversity directive that's being negotiated at the moment, the opportunity to use, if what's the suggestions are accepted, the opportunity to use trees, biomass from trees immediately as energy is going to leave us, or much of it's going to leave us. So this idea that biomass is a green energy we need to move away from because of our concern for biodiversity.
Okay. There's a question that's come in probably from one of the industry speakers. How can we recycle mineral wool by closing the loop without an energy-intensive process?
I can react. I mean, first, it has been said by Kurt, there can be options of reusage and to design products in order for them to be reused whenever it's possible. You know that our products are based on efficiency, and so you need to make sure that even the reusable product is as efficient as the new product. And then, whenever you recycle, in any case, you reduce significantly the energy consumption. And whenever you replace 1 ton of sand by 1 ton of recycled glass in the production either of flat glass or of glass wool, you reduce by more than 300 kilo the CO2 emissions, simply because the temperature of remelting is far lower than the temperature of melting of raw material. Yes, it remains energy intensive, but much less than with raw materials.
Anthony?
Yeah, and another example, within stone wool, you're actually able to recycle a percentage of the material not going through the melter, so you don't remelt it. And that's contributing around, I think I mentioned earlier, around 10% improvement in the carbon intensity of the factory. That will, of course, vary depending on the factory, but around, on average, 10%. And there's certain thresholds that you can work with there. There's certain limits. And, of course, as an industry, we're constantly looking at, how can we change those? How can we address those thresholds so we can actually recycle more material without going into the melter?
Okay, so the point of the question is not how can we recycle without an energy-intensive process, but that recycling is always more energy efficient than using virgin material. One more question that came in, which is to you, Kurt. Picking up on, you mentioned a need to develop quality renovation strategies with energy suppliers and other partners in the heating sector. And the person's acting, can you elaborate a bit more on what you had in mind there? What kind of cooperation between what kind of actors did you have in mind?
Well, to pick up on the emphasis that Catherine puts on the need for a systemic approach, I think we also need a systemic innovation approach in the context of renovation. We see already very good examples going on in terms of district renovations, for example. We see examples of companies that do renovations in one day while the inhabitants stay in their house. We see new types of service providers coming onto the market, like energy service companies. All that requires that we look not just at the products and how to bring the products to the building sector, but also how to deploy them with new business models, new financing models, looking at what kind of regulation we need for that, also at the local and regional or national level, for example. So it's that kind of new approach whereby the company's value chain can work with others in different sectors to come up with partnerships that deliver these kinds of more systemic solutions, because the renovations will have to be, as I said, much quicker, at much larger scale, with a lot more energy efficiency as a result, but also in a way that people and households will want to actually engage in these, so that it is not a nuisance and something that is costly, but something that everyone sees this is for a benefit and actually saves money over time.
Okay, thank you. We're coming up to the end of our hour, so this is a call for any final questions from those of you who have joined us today. I don't think I've seen any more come in for the moment, or any final questions from those on the panel. Comments or questions. Otherwise, Jan and I will wrap up in a moment. So Jan, you will still have the floor. Any final comments?
Looking forward to cooperation with Catherine, but also with Kurt, of course, going forward. I think it is needed for industry looking forward to take up and be challenged also from the outside to work on continuous progress. So very much appreciated.
Yeah, I think what I take away is indeed, thank you, Kurt, some very concrete feedback to Eurima on what you say is an excellent start, the roadmap, but looking ahead to interim targets, for example, yearly reporting, so something very, very concrete that could enhance it further from your perspective. And I guess looking ahead, I noted a couple of things that you say are going to be jobs for the next Commission already. So looking ahead to 2040 targets, and that work's going to kick off in a couple of weeks with a public consultation, you said. And second, also everything around circular economy, around the use of waste, the waste hierarchy. That reusing materials, that's going to be that's going to be a big job for the next Commission. And I noted you said we're going to be looking beyond decarbonisation to dematerialisation. That's the next big challenge. And then that concrete example of when it comes to supporting specific technologies for the transition, that the EU will be supporting green hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, with a fixed tariff, and potentially that model, if that works, going to be rolled out to other technologies going forward. Is there anything, I guess I'd ask to you to close, anything you'd add to that in terms of where you see this Commission ending up and the next Commission taking over? What's the next big thing that's going to have to be done in the next 5 years? Is there anything else you would add? How would you sum that up? If we take a very big picture perspective.
Yeah, this Commission has stayed the course. We launched the European Green Deal. We were told that we were the only ones, and why would we do this? Because 8% CO2 emissions. We have stayed the course ever since, through the pandemic, through the consequences of the end of the Ukraine event with the high energy prices, and now in response to the learning every time how to respond better. And I think that's what this Commission will continue to do, and set the scene for the next Commission so that it can go the next mile. And the next mile will be definitely in terms of working much more systemically on the circular economy, having even more international outreach than we are already doing today. And then I think what will also be very important is to even make the link even tighter between climate and biodiversity, as well as industrial policy. I see that as a big work stream ahead for the next incoming Commission. And we from DG Clima, with our colleagues in other services, will do what we can to prepare for that. But thank you all for your attention and big support for our Green Deal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you very much. Yeah, perhaps that we can wrap up. What I take away from today's meeting is that industries that have as objective to grow their markets, grow their market shares, and reinforce their license to operate need to look beyond business as usual. We need to do this by taking our own responsibilities and working closely with partners and allies and authorities to create our future sustainable business environment. We know that without an ambitious renovation and insulation strategy, the EU will have difficulties in reaching its 2050 objectives. This is why we think that a progressive but enabling industrial policy fostering sustainable growth, climate neutrality and circularity should be at the heart of policy and politics going forward in the EU. And we're looking very much forward to working with the EU and with Catherine Richardson on our continuous progress. And therefore, I would like to thank, on behalf of Eurima, all the speakers and participants, and we look forward to our continued cooperation. Thank you.
Yes, a big thank you to you all, and a round of applause for those of you here and for those of you who joined us virtually today. Thank you to our speakers and to all our participants, because obviously we wouldn't be doing this if you weren't there to join us. Thank you
to you, Sonia.
Thank you. Thank you. And the Eurima roadmap is downloadable on their site, so we look forward to continuing this conversation with you going forward in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you very much.